Hello, it's Marcus Catani here, and I'd like to give a talk that I've recently given, which we've called the Safety BMI, Developing an Integrated Approach to Monitoring Incident and Injury Risk. This project has been funded from the ECU Mars Centre, and we're very grateful for that funding. The project team includes myself, Anton Fuchs, David Eddy and Bobby Selleck. And we couldn't have done this work without the cooperation and generosity of a series of organisations that have donated their data. What the aim of the project is to do is to see if we can analyse existing data to help organisations forecast the risk of injuries. So what we've done is we've obtained a large amount of data from organisations, and if you would like to donate your data, please contact me. My details are at the end of the presentation, and we'd be absolutely delighted to inform you about how the project is running and also use your data. What we're doing is we've created a process that we've called the Safety BMI, which I'll explain in a moment, and we're validating that process using existing data. What we aim to do is to provide a formula for people to use with their own data. But before we do that, we need to validate it. So let's give a little bit of background. So first of all, serious injuries are actually quite rare. But because they're injuries to human beings, we don't tolerate them. But there's some anomalies here. For example, we're having about 13 million people going to work every day, about 200 fatalities and about 140,000 claims. That's usually for about 7 days off. So whilst injuries are quite rare, considering the number of people going to work, because they're to do with human beings, we don't tolerate people getting hurt. So the word tolerate is important because it's the level at risk at which an organisation changes its behaviour. So if we don't tolerate injuries and fatalities, we're going to go and do something about it. And that's a theme in this presentation and with this research, is seeing whether that toleration of risk is actually driving performance improvement. And I'll go into that a bit more. So here's the Australian workplace fatalities report, and you can see that over the last 10 or so years we've really plateaued our fatality performance. So this is interesting when we're talking about the toleration of risk, because we don't tolerate fatalities, but we haven't done enough, or we haven't done something to improve that performance. So what's going on here? We know that we don't tolerate fatalities, so maybe we're not looking into the right information. Maybe we're not measuring the right things to help us reduce that number of fatalities. So the safety data is being collected by everyone, and I'll show you in a moment that how much information is actually being collected. But what does this information actually tell us about risk? It's quite common for organisations to require everybody in effect to collect some data about their safety performance, whether it's a take 5 being done by the workers on the front line, or some catastrophic or some critical control verifications done by the leadership team. Huge amounts of data is being collected, but as we said, it's not actually helping us reduce that number of fatalities across the whole of Australia. So if it's not helping us reduce the number of fatalities, what do we need to do to improve? Maybe we need to monitor something else. And this research aims to produce a way process or to help us define what we need to measure. So this is West Australian fatalities. So quite often we'll use this sort of data to help us understand where we need to put our efforts in. So again, you can see that the number of fatalities has been fairly stable. We haven't had a nice reduction in that over the last few years. So if we drill down using the Safe Work Australia database, which is extraordinary resource, if you and publicly available, you can drill down and identify the highest risk of injuries. So for example, if you have a look here, you can see that the if you're a male, you're more likely to be injured fatally if you're driving a vehicle. There's 65% of the fatalities are to do with a vehicle, and if you're in this sort of mid range of age, you're more likely to be injured too. So you could say then, well, we've got a if you're a male driving a vehicle of this sort of age, you're more likely to have an injury. But we've seen already that the number of injuries isn't reducing. So the traditional approach of focusing on where the injuries are occurring may not be the best way to address this plateau. This sort of approach works really well at the beginnings of our journey in performance improvement. But what I'm proposing is that maybe it doesn't give us enough definition of what we need to do next. So here's a graph of data that's been collected by a mining organisation in Western Australia. And what it represents is the leaders going out into the workplace and having a look at whether the critical controls, that's the controls that are required to prevent fatalities, are in place for this particular hazard of working at heights. Now, don't worry too much about the individual height of the graphs, but what I want you to have a look at is where these red circles are, because this represents the boundary line between the non-compliant and the compliant. So you can see here in this last month, we've got, round about, let's say 10% of the observations are non-compliant. Now this is interesting because that line really has come from the leadership. I heard recently that an organisation had sacked a team of workers for not complying with their critical controls. But then another organisation with exactly the same sort of event decided not to sack the individual that had not complied with the critical controls. So the leadership team make that decision about what is tolerated. In one company, they won't tolerate non-compliance and they sacked out that team. In the other organisation, they said it was tolerated and they didn't sack that person. Even though their rules said they were going to sack them, they chose not to in the end. That has reset that organisation's toleration of risk. People will now think that they don't necessarily need to comply with that level, critical control, or even if they're a leader, maybe they don't need to comply. But you can see it's the organisation's toleration of risk which drives performance. So I'm just going to illustrate that again in a slightly different way. So for example, let's say that we've got an event. We don't know a great deal about this event at the moment because it's just occurred and the organisation hasn't really done anything about it, hasn't investigated it, hasn't tried to prevent it recurrence. So we could say then, well, if that event has had no action from the organisation, our level of toleration is above the event. In other words, that line indicates the level at which the organisation will change its behaviour. They haven't changed their behaviour, so we can say our event number 1 is below that toleration of risk. But then event number 2 happens, and maybe the general manager calls up the safety manager and says, "Hey, Katani, what on earth's going on here? We've had another event. We don't want a third event. We don't tolerate these sort of events. So we want you to do something about it." So in that scenario, you can say, okay, the repeat event has prompted the organization to change its behavior. So its toleration now becomes below event number 2. And because of that, they're going to investigate the incident, design some actions to prevent recurrence, and then monitor to make sure that those controls are in place. So this is really important. So the leadership team have set the toleration of risk. That toleration of risk has come because of the consequence of the incident or the repeat occurrence. They've put in place some actions to prevent recurrence. Okay, now the terms here that I've just used actually link back to our definition of risk, which comes from the global standard ISO 31000 risk management principles and guidelines, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So we've used that definition as the core of our process, and we've linked and mapped that to a series of variables. Keeping it quite simple, we've defined toleration, like I say, the level at which initiates change, and nothing happens unless risk is not tolerated. Consequence, the potential for harm. Now I've said within scope because this algorithm will be used at any scope, whether that is the whole oil rig or just the moving a box from point A to B. So the scope is just the scope of the task or the facility that we're looking at. Then the effectiveness of control is that capability to prevent harm. Okay, so what we've done is we've put together our conceptual model, which we've called the safety BMI, because in effect what's happened is that each of these functions, toleration, consequence, and effectiveness, also have a whole series of other variables feeding into it. And what we're doing at the moment is that we're verifying that this relationship, this ratio is actually working. And most of the time it does, but we found a couple of scenarios where we need to refine it slightly. But we're pretty confident that at the moment that this is the beginning of something quite useful. So what we've done to verify it is that we've taken a whole series of data from organizations, and we've used them to help us challenge the algorithm to make sure that we've got a good understanding of how it operates. We've used a very large number of incidents, and we've focused in on the fall from heights. What we've done is we've analysed the effectiveness of the organisation to prevent the recurrence of those incidents, and in particular looking at the repeat incidents. We found that repeat incidents are actually really important to us to describe the organisation's capability to prevent recurrence. So, for example, if you've had an incident and you've put in place controls and you think those controls are effective, and then you have another incident of a similar nature, that actually tells you quite a lot about the organisation's capability. It's also linked to the toleration of risk, so that leadership toleration, which is driving in performance improvement. If the organisation has a really good safety attitude, then they'll put some effort into preventing incidents occurring. Their capability will improve. So you can see there's a link between the toleration, the consequence, and the effectiveness. Our data set is defining the series of sort of sub-variables that feed into that, and we'll update you as we go. So in conclusion, we've created a conceptual model with a leadership focus, which we think is going to give organizations an opportunity to assess their performance using existing data. We've actually found that the data that is coming from our donors is actually probably not quite as good as they think. There's a whole series of missing data, and sometimes that data quality isn't so good. That's actually quite important to us, because what it means is that people are collecting information just because they've been told to, rather than it actually adding to the effectiveness of the controls. What we're aiming to do is to give people some understanding of what data is most likely to assist them to manage the controls. So in other words, if they're collecting 100 data sets, but only 10 of those are actually adding to the prevention of injuries and fatalities, then let's just concentrate on the making quality observations and quality information rather than reducing that. So we're going to update you on this as with some academic and other papers. The people that and organisations that are helping us with the research will get to know that first. So if you want to know how we're going, please give me a ring or an email, and I'll be happy to involve you in the project. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.